Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I still remember the day I found the door. It was one of those gloomy afternoons when the sky seemed to be weighed down with clouds. The kind of day that lingers in a dull gray haze, making everything feel heavier than usual. I had been walking through the alley, a shortcut I often took to avoid the main road. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though it hadn't started falling yet. The ground was damp, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed faintly in the distance. The alley was narrow, just wide enough for two people to pass each other. But it always felt much smaller, as if the walls were closing in a little more each time I walked through. It was lined with old brick buildings that had seen better days, their paint peeling and windows cracked. The windows were often covered with layers of grime and dust, making them impossible to see through. It was an alley that seemed forgotten by time, neglected by the city around it, and for some reason, I found myself walking through it more often than I'd care to admit. That particular day, something felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. It wasn't anything tangible, not a noise or a shift in the air, but more of a quiet discomfort that settled over me as I walked. I tried to ignore it, brushing it aside as just a passing feeling, but it lingered. I was halfway through the alley when I noticed it, just a sliver at first, hidden behind a dumpster. It was a door, or rather, what looked like a door, though it was set into the brick wall at an odd angle, as though it had been forgotten or abandoned for years. The wood was weathered, darkened by time and the elements, with peeling paint and rusty hinges that looked like they hadn't moved in ages. It was so out of place in this crumbling alley, where everything else seemed to belong to another era. No one had ever mentioned this door before, not in the stories or rumors I had heard about the alley. And yet, there it was, staring at me, like it had been waiting. I approached it cautiously, unsure of why I felt such an unsettling pull toward it. The door seemed almost inviting, though not in the way doors are meant to be. It wasn't the kind of door you'd see on a house or an office building, but rather the kind that seemed to lead nowhere, an unspoken invitation to enter a place hidden from the world. There was no handle or knob, just a faint crack running down the center of the door, as if something or someone had tried to open it long ago and failed. The thought of turning the door handle, if there even was one, sent a shiver down my spine. But my curiosity, a small spark of something deeper, kept me rooted in place. I reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the cold, rough wood. It felt strange, like the door had absorbed the moisture from the air around it. For a brief moment, I swore I felt a slight tremor on the other side, a subtle vibration, as though something was moving just beyond the door. But when I pulled my hand away, everything was still. It was almost as if the door was aware of me, aware of my presence, and waiting. I glanced around the alley, as if expecting someone to come from the shadows. But the street was deserted, the usual hum of distant traffic muffled by the rain, which had now started to fall in a fine mist. The air had turned cooler, and the dampness of the stone beneath my feet began to seep into my shoes. The rain, soft but persistent, splattered against the walls of the alley, its rhythm like a quiet heartbeat. The door seemed to call to me. A whisper in the back of my mind. I hesitated, my heart racing, not because I feared what might be behind the door, but because I didn't know if I wanted to know. Still, the curiosity gnawed at me, relentless. I took a step closer, pushing aside the discomfort that had taken root in my chest. I needed to know what it was, why it was there, and why no one had ever mentioned it. When I touched the door again, I felt something shift. A soft click, barely audible, and the door creaked. It wasn't a violent sound, but a slow, reluctant groan, as though the door itself had been waiting for this moment. I hesitated for only a second, and then, before I could stop myself, I pushed. The door didn't swing open all at once, but instead, it gave way with an odd resistance, as if it had been blocked by something, then reluctantly surrendered. The moment it opened, the smell hit me. It was a musty, old, scent-like damp earth, and something faintly metallic, as though I were stepping into an underground cavern. The faintest hint of decay lingered in the air, but it wasn't overpowering, just a quiet presence. I stepped through the threshold and immediately felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air was different here still, stagnant, as if it had been trapped for years, untouched by the world outside. The light from the alley barely reached inside, but what little illumination there was seemed to cast long, strange shadows that danced along the walls, creating shapes that were both familiar and unsettling. I stood still, unsure whether to move forward. The room beyond the door was empty, save for the cobwebs that draped over the corners, thick with dust. The floor was made of uneven stone tiles, cracked in places. It was a small space, but it felt vast in a way, like a forgotten part of the city that had been sealed away. There were no windows, no visible exits, just the walls, closing in like the inside of a box. I took a few cautious steps inside, my shoes tapping softly against the stone floor. The air felt heavier here, the walls almost pressing in, as if the room itself was alive. I turned around, and the door, which I had just passed through, had already begun to fade into the shadows, as though the very act of stepping inside had erased the connection between this world and the one outside. The alley, with its distant sounds of rain, was now a memory, distant and unreachable. It wasn't until I took a few more steps that I began to notice the oddness of the space. There were no signs of life, no furniture, I felt an undeniable presence, like someone was watching, standing just out of sight. My mind raced, but my body refused to cooperate, to numb, to turn around and leave. Instead, I continued exploring, each step deeper into this forgotten place. I don't know how long I stayed there, wandering through the silence. There were no sounds, no movement, just the quiet hum of something just beyond the edge of perception. But something else, something more subtle, began to creep in. The shadows? They seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, like something was moving just beyond my sight. I would turn quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but each time, I was met with nothing but stillness. After what felt like hours, I decided it was time to leave. I turned back toward the door, but when I reached it, I stopped. The door that had let me in was gone. Not gone in the sense that it had vanished, no. The door had simply faded into the wall, as if it had never existed. There was no trace of the crack or the wood, no mark on the stone where the door had once been, just an ordinary brick wall. I stood there for a long time, staring at the place where the door had been. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I wasn't alone. The room, this space, was not empty, it was waiting. But for what, I couldn't say. I don't remember how I left. I only know that I found myself back on the street, the rain still falling softly around me. The alley was just as I had left it, quiet, empty, and completely unchanged. But in my chest, I felt something hollow, an unsettling emptiness, as though I had left part of myself behind. No one knows about the door, not really, not in the way I know it. Every time I walk past that alley now, I can't help but glance down it, half expecting to see the door again, waiting. But it's always gone, just another forgotten corner of the city. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe I'm not meant to know where it leads. But I can't stop thinking about it. The feeling of something watching, something waiting, just out of sight. And so I walk, and I wait, too. It was one of those nights where the world felt too quiet, like something was missing, or maybe it was just me. The city had settled into that muted hum it often gets at the edge of evening, where everything seems distant, soft, as though it were all behind a veil of fog. I had spent the day working, moving through my routine without much thought. But somewhere between dinner and the darkening sky, something shifted. I didn't know it yet, but this was the night things would begin to unravel. It started innocently, Inifa, chance encounter with a stranger at a cafe I didn't frequent. She was older, probably in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to know things about people before they spoke. She wasn't the sort of person who drew attention, but there was something about her presence that made it impossible to ignore. She sat alone at a table near the window, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her eyes on the street outside, though she didn't seem to be looking at anything in particular. When I sat down at a table nearby, she glanced at me briefly, then went back to staring at the world beyond the glass. But after a few minutes, she stood up and walked over to me, her steps measured but sure. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I couldn't help but notice you. You seem interested in things you shouldn't be." I blinked, unsure of what to make of her words. I'd been lost in thought, and her observation seemed both random and oddly perceptive. She didn't wait for me to respond. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward me. It was old, yellowed at the edges, and looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. "Take it," she said, as though she were handing me something much more valuable than a scrap of paper. "You'll need it soon." The paper felt heavier than I expected, almost like there was more to it than just ink on paper. I unfolded it slowly, and there it was, a map. At first glance, it looked like a simple blueprint of a part of the city I didn't recognize. It wasn't drawn with the precision of modern maps. Instead, it had a hand-drawn quality, like something out of a dream or an old detective novel. There were streets I knew, but there were also strange, tangled paths that led to a place I couldn't identify, an area marked only with the words, "The Hotel of Lost Things." "What's this?" I asked, my voice uncertain as I stared at the map. "It's a place," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "A hotel, if you want to call it that. You'll find it, eventually." I felt a chill creep up my spine. It wasn't the map itself, no. The map was intriguing in an abstract, old-world sense, like a treasure map that promised adventure. But her words, the way she spoke, as though she were talking about something that should be known, yet wasn't, made me uneasy. I had to ask the obvious question. "What's the Hotel of Lost Things?" I said. The woman's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "It's a place for those who have lost what they can't find anywhere else. Sometimes it's physical. Other times it's more than that." She left without another word, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, vanishing out the door and into the rain-soaked night. I sat there, staring at the map, feeling the weight of her presence lingering in the air. I wasn't sure why, but something about her had unsettled me. Still, the map seemed harmless enough, a curiosity, a strange gift, and so I folded it back up and tucked it into my coat pocket. I didn't think about it much that night, but the next day, the map burned in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the place it led to, and the words she'd used. A hotel for those who have lost. What did that even mean? I decided to follow the map. There was something about it that kept pulling me forward. Like a magnetic force I couldn't escape. The streets it described weren't far from where I lived, but they weren't familiar either. I had walked the city countless times, but these alleys, these side streets, felt like they belonged to a world just outside of mine. As I traced the path on the map, I felt a strange disconnect from the surroundings. The buildings seemed to blur, and the people walking by appeared as though they were just shadows passing through. The map led me to an old part of the city, one that seemed almost forgotten. The streets were narrow and lined with buildings that had clearly seen better days. Their facades cracked and weathered, the windows dusty and obscured by age. It felt like walking through a ghost town. I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me was holding its breath. I followed the map through twisting streets until I reached the final destination, a corner of the city where a tall, imposing building stood at the end of a narrow alley. It looked like an old hotel, but it didn't belong. The architecture was mismatched, like it had been pieced together over the years with parts from different eras. The windows were dark, as if no one had been inside for decades, and there was a heavy, oppressive silence hanging in the air. My heart beat faster as I approached, unsure of what to expect. I stood before the building for a long time, studying the faded sign above the door. It simply read "The Hotel of Lost Things" in cracked, faded letters. I glanced down at the map again, confirming that this was the place. The building matched every detail of the drawing, but something was off. Something didn't feel right. I reached for the door handle. It was cold under my fingers, as though it had been waiting for me to touch it. But just as I was about to turn it, a voice spoke from behind me. "It doesn't exist, you know." I turned quickly, my heart skipping a beat. No one was there, but then I noticed the woman, the one from the cafe, standing at the other end of the alley, just far enough away that I couldn't make out her face clearly. She was watching me, her posture calm, as though this was exactly where she had expected me to be.
"What do you mean?"
I called out, but my voice felt strange, distant. "It's not real," she said softly, her voice carrying through the quiet street. "This place, it's just a story, a memory, a myth." I stood frozen, staring at the building in front of me, my mind spinning. I could feel the door handle beneath my fingers, but it was as if the world around me was beginning to fade. The woman's words echoed in my mind, and suddenly, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I turned back to the hotel, but when I looked up, the building was gone. In its place was just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, the remnants of a place that had never existed at all. The map in my pocket was gone too. I walked away, the alley stretching out in front of me like a never-ending tunnel. The woman had disappeared as well, and the city felt too quiet. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what I saw, or if I ever really saw it. But I can't shake the feeling that I was supposed to find something that doesn't exist. And every time I close my eyes, I can still see the faded sign, the door that was never meant to open, and the woman's smile, as if she knew exactly what I was going to discover just a little too late. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if it was all just a dream. It was one of those ordinary evenings, the kind where everything seems to hum along in a predictable rhythm. I was riding the subway back home after a long day at work. The train was crowded, the usual mix of tired commuters, their faces blank, each person lost in their own world. I had my headphones in, the soft hum of the train merging with the quiet music in my ears. The rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the tracks was comforting, almost soothing. But there was something different that night, something I didn't recognize at the time. As we approached my usual stop, the train slowed, like it always did, with a soft groan of metal against metal. But when it came to a full stop, something felt off. The air in the car seemed to shift, like a faint pressure had built up around us. It was subtle, at first a brief pause in the usual sounds of the train, but it lingered, stretching the moment, longer than it should have. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. The other passengers were as detached as ever, their eyes focused on their phones, the newspaper, or the floor, their movements mechanical. The train doors slid open, with the familiar whoosh, but something was different. The air that seeped into the car wasn't the musty, underground smell I was used to. It was fresh, almost too fresh, like the scent of rain on a cool spring morning, the kind of smell that makes you pause and take in the world around you. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt like I was breathing in a different time. I waited, expecting someone to board, but no one did. And then I noticed the platform outside the train was empty, eerily so. It was always bustling with people, especially at this hour, but tonight there wasn't a single soul in sight. I stared at the empty platform, my heart thumping in my chest for reasons I couldn't understand. I pulled my headphones out, the sudden quiet of the train making me acutely aware of the stillness. I looked up at the train doors and realized that I had no idea where I was. The station wasn't one I recognized. The walls were old, worn down, and the fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. It wasn't just the station. It was the entire subway car. The worn leather seats, the metal poles, the walls, all of it felt older. It was like someone had taken a time machine and dropped me into a subway car from decades ago. I stood up slowly, instinctively glancing out the door again. The platform had changed. The signs were different, the letters not quite in the right places. The usual modern design of the station had vanished, replaced by something that looked much older, vintage, almost antique. The platform was made of stone, not concrete, and the walls had a pattern to them that felt out of place. There were gas lamps lining the platform, their dull light flickering in the dimness. I blinked, sure I was imagining things, but when I looked again, nothing had changed. The train doors remained open, and the station outside was stuck in a different era. I stepped off the train, the click of my shoes echoing louder than it should have. My breath caught in my throat. The subway tunnel that should have stretched on ahead into darkness was different. It wasn't the modern, clean-cut tunnels I was used to. Instead, it looked like it was built out of old brick, the stone damp. With age, the air was cooler here, filled with a strange stillness, like no one had passed through in years. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It wasn't just the station or the train that felt out of place, it was the entire atmosphere, as though I had stepped into a memory, one I didn't belong in. The silence around me pressed down on my chest, and I could hear the faint sound of something in the distance, like footsteps, slow, deliberate. I turned, but there was no one there. The doors to the subway car slid shut behind me with a soft hiss, and I realized, suddenly, that I had no idea where the train had gone. My stop was just a few minutes away, but the train didn't seem to be coming back. Panic fluttered in my chest for a split second before I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to leave, needed to find my way back to where I belonged. But no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling of disorientation, the feeling that this place wasn't quite right, it lingered. I walked a few steps down the platform, my mind racing. I had seen this before, or something like it. The worn walls, the strange gas lamps. But from where? I couldn't remember, couldn't place it. Then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. It was closer this time, and though I didn't see anyone, I could feel them there, just out of sight, like a presence lurking in the shadows. I turned a corner, and the tunnel stretched out before me, and there it was, a door. It wasn't supposed to be there, at least not in any subway I'd ever been in. It was an old wooden door, covered in dark varnish that had long since faded. It was so out of place, like it had been dropped into the middle of the tunnel by accident. I stared at it, the urge to open it pulling at me, a quiet curiosity gnawing at the back of my mind. Something made me hesitate, though I wasn't sure why. But the closer I got to the door, the more the air around me felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I reached out for the handle, my hand trembling, but before I could touch it, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The platform was still empty. The door, it was calling to me. I opened it, and as I did, a strange chill ran down my spine. Beyond the door was a room unlike anything I had seen before. It wasn't just another room, it felt like stepping into a different time altogether. The walls were lined with velvet curtains, the floor was covered in plush carpet, and there was a faint smell of wood smoke, like an old fireplace that hadn't been used in years. It was a hotel lobby, but not one I recognized. It was something from another time, a place long abandoned. The feeling of being out of time intensified, and I stepped into the room. But before I could look around, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but when I turned the handle to open it again, it wouldn't budge. The room was locked. I stood there, staring at the door, then turned to face the lobby. It was empty, no bellhop, no guests, nothing. The only light came from a chandelier hanging overhead, its glass slightly cracked. I approached the desk, hoping to find some sort of clue, some reason for the strange turn of events. But when I looked down at the desk, the only thing there was a small notebook. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn. I picked it up, and as I opened it, I found it filled with strange, swirling handwriting, unreadable, but almost familiar. A voice echoed from somewhere deep inside the hotel, soft and distant. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I turned, but no. One was there. The walls of the hotel seemed to close in on me, and the silence felt suffocating. I reached for my phone, only to realize it was dead. I tried to open the door again, but it was still locked. The air felt colder now, heavier, as though the hotel had a life of its own, and it was watching me. I had no idea how I had gotten here, or how I would leave, but one thing was certain. I wasn't meant to be here, and whatever had brought me into this strange, forgotten place wasn't about to let me go easily. I didn't expect much when I decided to take a walk that evening. The weather had turned cool, the air crisp in that way that makes you breathe a little deeper, feeling the fresh bite of autumn. The kind of day when you don't have anywhere to be, but the world feels like it's waiting for you to discover something. I had spent the day inside, staring at screens, trying to get some work done, but it was as if I could feel the walls closing in on me. So, I slipped on my jacket, left the house, and decided to take a walk. Nothing more. I had no particular destination in mind, just walking aimlessly through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. The houses all looked the same, the lawns a little too neat, the trees a little too well kept. It was one of those suburban areas where everyone seemed to have their life in order, at least on the surface. The roads were quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic muted by the evening fog that had started to creep in. I turned down a street I don't usually take, a small alleyway between two houses that I'd always passed by but never walked down. The alley was narrow, the space between the houses barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The air here was different, though it was thick, almost musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. There was a strange smell, faintly damp, with something metallic underneath it. The scent wasn't unpleasant, but it was odd enough to make me pause for a moment. I didn't think much of it. I stepped further in, letting the quiet of the alley fill my senses. The ground beneath my feet shifted from pavement to gravel, and I noticed how the trees here grew closer together, their branches twisting and turning above, blocking out the light from the street lamps behind me. The path narrowed even more, and I could feel the air grow heavier, like I had entered a different world, a place that didn't quite belong to the rest of the neighborhood. The alley, which had seemed so familiar when I first walked in, now felt strange, as though it had never been here before. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the feeling, but I couldn't. It wasn't until I reached the end of the path that I realized how far I had gone. The alley stretched out further than I thought it should have, and as I turned the corner, expecting to find a dead end or another street, I saw something entirely unexpected. A tunnel. It wasn't a tunnel in the traditional sense. It wasn't dark and foreboding like you might imagine a cave or an underground passage to be. No, This tunnel was almost inviting. It looked like the continuation of the alley, except that it was curved downward, like an archway of stone, its opening hidden behind the overgrown ivy that lined the walls. I couldn't remember seeing it before, yet here it was. As if it had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. I hesitated. Something inside me told me I shouldn't go in, that this wasn't a place I should explore. But the pull of curiosity, the odd feeling that something was waiting for me on the other side, was too strong. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right at the entrance. The tunnel smelled different from the rest of the alley, fresher, almost like rain after a long drought. The walls were rough, covered in moss and vines, but the path inside was clear. I stepped in. The tunnel felt long, though I couldn't quite tell how far it stretched. The moment I entered the outside world, those quiet suburban streets, the distant sounds of the city, the creeping fog seemed to disappear. It wasn't like I entered another realm, but it was as if the tunnel held its own space, a place suspended between two realities. The air inside was cool, but not unpleasantly so, and the further I walked, the more I felt like I was heading toward something. Time seemed to shift. The passage ahead of me wasn't exactly straight, more like it wound gently downward in a subtle curve. I could feel the weight of the walls surrounding me, but they didn't seem oppressive. Instead, they felt protective, almost like they were guiding me towards something. I noticed the faintest glow ahead, a soft light that didn't belong in a tunnel at all. When I reached the end, the tunnel opened into a small room. It was barely more than a corridor, but it was well lit, the source of the light unclear. The room was filled with an odd sense of familiarity. The walls were lined with shelves, but the objects on them were blurry, out of focus, as if my mind couldn't quite make sense of what they were. The air was still, and yet there was a feeling of movement, something faint, something just out of sight, like a ripple running through the space. But it wasn't the room that caught my attention, it was the door. At the far end of the small room, there was a wooden door, old but sturdy, with a brass handle that looked polished and new, despite its age. It stood there, like it had been waiting for me to find it. My heart beat a little faster as I approached. Something about that door, about the way it seemed so out of place, sent a chill down my spine. But I couldn't help it. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. And then I stopped. The hallway was my hallway, my own house. I blinked, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The walls were the same wallpaper I had picked out when I first moved in. The carpet was the same, worn down in places from years of use. Even the familiar scent of my home coffee in the morning, the faint traces of laundry detergent seemed to fill the air. It was my house, but it couldn't be. I had just come through a tunnel, hadn't I? I had just walked through a strange path in the alley, one that had led me far away from home, to a place I had never seen. I took a step into the hallway, then another. Everything felt too real, too ordinary, as though nothing had changed. But it didn't make sense. How could this be? I turned to look behind me. The tunnel was gone. The small room, the shelves, the soft light, they were all gone. There was nothing but the hallway, the same one I had left only minutes ago. The door behind me had vanished, leaving nothing but the empty space of my home. It was as if the tunnel had never existed, as if it had all been a dream, a strange moment out of time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped somewhere else, somewhere beyond the limits of my understanding. The hallway stretched out before me, the door to the living room in front of me, the soft sound of the clock ticking in the background. I took a breath, slowly, trying to ground myself, but something felt wrong. I was home, yes, but I was also far from it, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that the house wasn't mine anymore, that somehow, somewhere, the tunnel had brought me back, but not in the way I had left. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to figure it out, the air in my house now thick with uncertainty, but the feeling never left. The tunnel, the door, the room, all of it stayed with me, just out of reach, like something waiting in the corner of my mind, just waiting for me to remember. And now, every time I walk down that hallway, I can feel the pull again, as if the tunnel is still there, hidden just beyond the door, waiting for me to return. It was a late afternoon when I met her. The light outside was fading, casting everything in that soft, golden glow that makes the ordinary world look magical. I was walking home after a particularly long day, my mind wandering between the tasks I hadn't completed and the promises I hadn't kept. I'd taken the same route I always did, through the park, down the familiar streets, but this time, something was different. I didn't notice her at first. It wasn't until she spoke that I realized she had been walking beside me all along. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I think you're lost." I glanced at her, startled. She was a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with a look of quiet intensity in her eyes. She wore an old-fashioned coat, a long woolen thing that seemed out of place, like she had stepped out of another time. Her hair was dark, pulled back loosely into a bun, and she carried herself with a certain calmness, as if the world around her moved slower than it did for everyone else. "Lost?" I asked, confused. "I'm just heading home." She smiled faintly. "Not yet. You're not there yet." I wasn't sure what to make of her words, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just someone who liked to talk. Two strangers. I nodded and kept walking, but then she fell in step beside me again, her presence almost too quiet to ignore. "Follow me," she said, her tone gentle but persistent. "Trust me, you'll get home faster if you follow me." I hesitated for a moment. There was something about the way she said it, like she already knew where I was headed, like she had been waiting for me. There was a strange pull in her voice, an invitation that was hard to resist. So, against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. I didn't say anything, but I followed. We walked through the park, the path winding along the edge of the trees, where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves. It was a quiet evening, the air still and cool. The park, usually a bustling place filled with families and runners, seemed empty. I couldn't remember ever seeing it so quiet. The sound of our footsteps echoed on the gravel path, too loud in the silence. I glanced around, but the park seemed familiar and strange at the same time. It was as if the world had shifted slightly. She led me down a different route than I would usually take, and though I didn't think much of it at first, I started to notice something unsettling. The park paths that usually converged in familiar ways, leading to the playground. The small pond, the old bench under the oak tree, seemed to blur together. The trees around us grew denser, the shadows longer, and the sky had dimmed quicker than it should have. We kept walking. I tried to keep track of where we were going, but after a few more turns, it was as if the park itself had changed. The streetlights that were supposed to flicker on at the edge of the path stayed dark, their dull yellow glow absent. The familiar landmarks, the benches, the little bridge over the stream, the winding paths had all disappeared. Instead, there was only more of the same: trees, empty stretches of grass, and shadows that seemed to stretch in strange directions. Every corner we turned felt like it was the same corner we had passed before. At some point, I realized we weren't moving forward anymore. We were just walking in circles. I paused, a growing unease settling in my stomach. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice a little sharper than I intended. "This doesn't look like the way home." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to me and gave a soft, almost amused smile. "It's not about the destination," she said, her voice calm and sure. "It's about the journey. Trust the path, and it will lead you where you need to go." I didn't understand what she meant. All I could think about was how strange everything had become. The park that had been so familiar just moments ago now seemed like a maze. The trees loomed over us, their branches casting eerie shadows on the path. We had passed the same stone fountain twice, and now, as I glanced around, I realized that everything looked the same: the winding trails, the distant hills, the patches of grass. They were all identical to what I had seen before. "Where are we?" I asked again, my voice tinged with panic now. "Why does it feel like we're going in circles?" She turned to me, her face calm, serene. "You're exactly where you need to be," she said softly, as though I should have understood. "You've always been here. All you had to do was follow." I shook my head, trying to shake off the creeping sense of disorientation that was washing over me. Something wasn't right. I had no idea how long we had been walking, but the park felt like it was closing in on me. I looked around, trying to find anything that made sense. But the same trees stretched endlessly in every direction, the path ahead indistinguishable from the one behind. I stopped. "I need to go home," I said, my voice desperate. "Now this isn't right." She didn't stop. She just kept walking, as if she hadn't heard me, or perhaps as if she didn't need to. I stood there for a moment, caught between the urge to follow her and the overwhelming need to escape. Finally, I turned and began walking the way we had come, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I walked, the more the park began to feel wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the shadows between the trees weren't just shadows, but something else. Something watching from the darkness. My breath quickened, and my legs felt heavy, as if the path itself was trying to hold me back. I glanced behind me, expecting to see her standing there, waiting for me to follow, but there was nothing, no one. The park had returned to its eerie silence, empty and still, as though nothing had happened at all. I didn't know how much time had passed when I finally reached the edge of the park. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the familiar hum of streetlights and distant cars filling my ears again. The world outside the park was the same, unchanged. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing at the entrance, waiting for me to turn back. But there was nothing. The park was empty, as it always had been. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, because I couldn't explain it. I walked home, the evening passing uneventfully after that. But something about the whole experience stayed with me. Every time I pass that park now, I can't help but glance down the winding paths, half expecting to see her again, to find myself walking in circles once more. I don't know who she was, or what she wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that she'll be there again, waiting. It was one of those rare, peaceful evenings when the world felt perfectly still, as though the city had momentarily exhaled, taking a break from its usual hum. The sky had darkened into a deep shade of indigo, and the streetlights flickered to life, casting a soft glow on the wet pavement below. It had rained earlier in the day, and the smell of damp earth still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of exhaust from the passing cars. I had just finished up a late meeting, and was walking home, my footsteps echoing on the deserted street. It was a quiet part of the city, away from the busy centers, and most of the shops were closed for the night. I had walked this route 100 times before, so the street felt familiar, comfortable even. But tonight, there was something different. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, even as I tried to ignore it. The street was completely empty. Not a single soul was out. Not even a stray dog or a late-night jogger. Only the sound of my shoes against the pavement filled the air. It wasn't unusual, not really. This time of night, this part of town, it's always quiet. But tonight, it felt too quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I continued walking, my mind wandering, lost in the rhythm of my steps. The city's quietness had always been comforting, a reprieve from the chaos of the day. But something about the silence tonight felt off. There was a tension in the air, like a string pulled too tight, just waiting to snap. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the feeling was unmistakable. And then, I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought I had imagined it. A soft thud, followed by another. And then the unmistakable sound of feet hitting the pavement in quick succession. But when I glanced behind me, there was no one there. The street remained empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. No movement, no sign of anyone. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the sound of water dripping from the gutters, or the wind stirring the trees, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I picked up my pace, hoping to shake off the creeping sensation that someone or something was following me. But then, I heard it again. Closer this time. The sound of running feet, the thudding of footsteps against the wet pavement, rhythmic and steady, matching my pace. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing, and turned around. The street behind me was still empty. Nothing. Just the dim light of the street lamps, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. My breath caught in my throat, as the silence pressed in on me, heavy and unnerving. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, my eyes scanning the street, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. No figure, no shadow, no car passing by. It was as if I was completely alone, and yet the sound of running continued, echoing in the stillness. I began walking again, this time faster, my footsteps now outpacing the sound of the running. But no matter how fast I moved, it kept pace with me, the thud of feet behind me, always just a few steps away. It was almost as if someone or something was trailing me, staying just out of sight, following me down the street. My breath grew shallow, panic rising in my chest. I had to look again. I had to be sure. I turned around quickly, my heart thundering in my ears, ready to confront whatever it was that had been following me. But there was nothing. The street was as empty as it had been when I first noticed the sound. I paused, confused, disoriented. I couldn't understand what was happening. The sound of running stopped the moment I stopped walking. But as soon as I started moving again, it resumed. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't my imagination. Something was definitely behind me. I tried to calm myself, but my pulse was racing now, my hands trembling. I was alone in this empty street, yet it felt as if I wasn't. It was as if something invisible was trailing me, matching my every move, staying just out of view. At that moment, I heard a voice. Soft, distant, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A whisper, so faint that I could barely make it out. But the words were clear enough. Asterisk, you're not alone. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from behind me. It wasn't coming from any direction at all. It was just there, hanging in the air, like an echo of something forgotten, something old. The street felt even emptier now, the shadows stretching longer, as if the darkness itself were reaching out, closing in on me. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't. I didn't want to know what was there. All I wanted was to get home, to reach the safety of my apartment where I could lock the door and forget about this. I quickened my pace even more, my feet pounding against the pavement, the sound of running behind me intensifying, echoing louder, closer. It was almost like a race now, my footsteps, the sound of the running, all blending together in a maddening rhythm. I turned the corner, hoping to find some street with people, some sign of life. But there was nothing. No cars, no pedestrians, no movement. The world was still, eerily still, as if it had frozen. The sound of running continued, and I couldn't take it anymore. I turned sharply, stopping dead in my tracks. The air felt heavy now, suffocating. I looked over my shoulder one last time. Still no one. The street behind me was completely empty. No running footsteps. No shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Just the empty, silent street. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all, if the entire thing had been some twisted figment of my mind, the result of exhaustion or stress. But even as I stood there, trying to convince myself that I had overreacted, that nothing had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, watching, waiting. I didn't look back again as I continued my walk home. I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I was walking toward my apartment or running from something I couldn't see. But I knew one thing for sure. The streets were no longer as empty as they seemed. And even though I couldn't hear the running anymore, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never really alone in the city's silence. I had always walked the same route home. It wasn't particularly scenic, nor was it the quickest way, but it was mine. The walk took me through a quiet part of town, with old houses and crooked sidewalks, the kind of place that felt comfortable and familiar. Most nights, I'd be lost in my thoughts, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps, and the occasional rustle of leaves, my only companions. But one evening, something changed. It wasn't drastic at first, just a subtle shift, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started on the first block. I was crossing the street when I saw her standing on the corner. At first, I thought she was just another passerby, but there was something about the way she stood there, perfectly still, as if she were waiting for something. She was wearing a long coat, dark and heavy for the season, and her face was partially obscured by a scarf. It wasn't unusual for people to be out this late, but there was something off about her presence. Her stance, the way she looked at MIT, was as if she were expecting me. I hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable unease settle in my stomach, but when I blinked, she was gone. No movement, no footsteps, just an empty corner where she had stood only a second before. I chalked it up to fatigue. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe it had been someone else, someone I hadn't noticed. I continued walking, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered. But as I turned the next corner, there she was again, standing at the end of the block, her back turned to me, still as stone. The same long coat, the same scarf, but this time, she was facing away, her posture a little more rigid, as if she were holding her breath. I stopped in my tracks. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I felt the unmistakable pulse of panic rise in my chest. How could she be there? I had just seen her on the previous block, and now, here she was again. I looked around, but the street was quiet, still no one else in sight. I took a deep breath and tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was walking the same route. Maybe she was just taking her time, but then she turned. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she had been waiting for me to notice her. Her face was fully visible now, and I saw her eyes dark, almost unnaturally so, as though they were empty pits, staring right through me. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. I felt like I had stumbled into a dream, one that I couldn't wake from. Without a word, she started walking toward me, and I instinctively backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. But before I could react further, I blinked again, and she was gone. This time, the air around me seemed too quiet, too still. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring down the street, waiting for her to appear again, to explain herself, or maybe to disappear altogether. But nothing happened. The street was empty, the night cold and silent. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was seeing things, but as I continued my walk, the unease remained, a constant weight pressing on my chest. My thoughts spiraled as I turned onto the next block, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sensation of her eyes, watching, following me, refused to leave. Then, just as I passed the third block, I saw her again. She was standing in front of a house this time, staring down the street with that same expressionless gaze, her scarf a little higher, her coat a little more worn, as if time had passed and yet nothing had changed. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't normal. This couldn't be normal. I tried to speak to her this time, to demand an explanation, but my voice wouldn't come out. My legs were frozen, my body locked in place by an invisible force. All I could do was watch as she turned her head, meeting my eyes with that same chilling stare. But something was different. Her face, once expressionless, now held the faintest trace of a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was empty, hollow, like a smile worn out from too many years of practice. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, the sound of my breath rushing in my ears, and yet, somehow, I knew she was still behind me, her presence always just beyond my sight. I didn't stop until I reached the next block, breathless, heart racing, and once again, I looked back, but this time, she wasn't there. I don't know how long I stood there, my eyes darting over every corner, every shadow. I don't know how long I stood, waiting for her to appear again, but she didn't. I eventually made it home, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys, my mind racing. When I closed the door behind me, I thought I would be safe. I thought I would be free. But something inside me told me that I wasn't. That the woman, no, she was still out there, somewhere, waiting. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went through the motions of my routine. But every block, every street I walked down, I kept seeing her. She was there in the corner of my mind, her eyes, her smile, following me, as if she had been there all along. And then it happened again. As I was walking home that evening, the street empty once more, I saw her standing ahead. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood another version of herself. They looked identical, same coat, same scarf, same hollow expression. But now there were two of them, standing side by side, staring at me with those same dark eyes, that same eerie smile. And it wasn't just two. As I walked closer, I realized there were more. Another, and another. All versions of her, different in small, subtle ways. Changes in the coat, the scarf, their posture. But they all had the same smile, the same eyes. And then, they all turned toward me, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I don't know what happened after that. I ran again, as fast as I could, until I couldn't see them anymore. But I can't shake the feeling that no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, they're always there, somewhere, waiting for me. And every time I close my eyes, I know I'll see them again, staring, waiting for me to catch up, because, somewhere, somehow, I know they're not finished with me yet. It was an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of night that felt like a warm, cozy cocoon after a long week. I was on my way home, just a few blocks from the apartment, when I decided to cut through the park to enjoy the fresh air before settling in for the night. The streets had that hushed, evening calm about them. People were either at home already, or out in the local cafes and restaurants, their voices barely audible in the cool air. Everything felt like it was in its place, and I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. The park was just a small patch of green tucked between two older buildings, with well-worn paths and trees that had been around for decades. I always took the same route through it when I was walking home, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the sound of birdsong, even though it was nearing dusk. But tonight, there was someone there, standing by the old stone fountain near the center of the park. She caught my eye immediately. She wasn't dressed for the weather, wearing a thick sweater and a scarf, even though the evening was warm enough that a jacket would have sufficed. She looked out of place. Somehow her posture was stiff, as if she were waiting for something or someone. I slowed my pace as I approached her, and she noticed me. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that I wasn't prepared for, and she gave me a small, nervous smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but with an edge of urgency. "Can you help me? I'm a bit lost." I stopped, instinctively, trying to gauge if she was someone I should be concerned about, if she was genuinely lost, or if something was wrong. But her face seemed sincere, if a bit anxious. "Of course. Where are you trying to go?" I asked, my tone light, trying to help her feel more at ease. She looked down at the ground for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts. "I'm looking for 4th Avenue, she said, glancing back up at me. "Can you tell me how to get there?" It wasn't unusual to be asked for directions, but what caught my attention was the way she asked. There was a hesitation in her voice, as if she wasn't entirely sure whether she was asking the right person. She seemed distant somehow, disconnected from her surroundings, like she wasn't really there with me. Still, I didn't think too much of it. 4th Avenue, I repeated, trying to place it in my mind. I lived in the area, and I had walked most of the streets nearby. But for some reason, I couldn't place it. I thought for a moment, I don't think there's a 4th Avenue around here, at least not in this part of town. "You sure you're in the right city?" Her brow furrowed slightly, and she looked around as if searching for something familiar. I couldn't help but notice how she seemed unsettled by my response. "I'm sure," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I've been walking all evening. I just need to find 4th Avenue." I watched her for a moment, then took a step back, trying to make sense of the conversation. Something felt strange, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The evening was quiet to quiet, and for a second, I felt like I had stepped out of my body, watching the interaction from some distance. "Okay," I said slowly, trying to be helpful. "Well, if you head down this street, you should hit Main Street in a couple of blocks. I don't think you'll find a 4th Avenue there, but it's worth checking. Maybe you've confused it with a different part of the city." She nodded, her eyes still a bit distant, and then, without another word, turned and began walking away. I watched her for a moment, still feeling that strange, unsettling pull, before turning back toward the park exit. Something felt off about the whole interaction, but I brushed it aside, reminding myself I was just tired from a long day. But then, the next day, it happened again. I was walking down the same street, taking the same path through the park, when I saw her again. This time, she was sitting on the same bench, looking down at a map in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. The moment she saw me, she looked up with that same expression, that same distant gaze. "Can you help me?" she asked again, as if we had never spoken before, her voice still soft, but now with an edge of desperation. "I'm trying to find 4th Avenue. Do you know where it is?" I stopped, momentarily frozen. I was certain I had seen her before, yet it didn't make sense. I had just seen her the previous evening, standing by the fountain. But this time, the park seemed different. The trees were a little more twisted, the path a little more overgrown. I forced myself to speak. "I thought I told you yesterday that there's no 4th Avenue around here," I said, trying to sound patient, but also puzzled. "Maybe you've got the wrong city. I've never heard of a 4th Avenue in this neighborhood." Her gaze hardened slightly, but there was no anger in her expression, just the same blankness. as though I hadn't said anything at all. "No, this is the right city," she insisted, standing up from the bench. "I just need to get there." I watched her carefully, trying to decipher the oddness of the situation. Her insistence was strange, but what was even stranger was that everything around us had changed. The street that should have been at the end of the park now looked unfamiliar, as though the buildings along it had shifted in some way. Their facades more worn, the streetlights dimmer. The park, too, felt off larger, somehow darker, with the same trees but twisted differently, almost like I had walked into a different version of the same place. I glanced at her again, and for the first time, I saw a faint hint of recognition in her eyes, as if she were seeing something in me that I couldn't understand. "You do know where it is," she said, her voice trembling slightly now. "You're just not remembering." I took a step back. "I don't know what you mean. This is my city. I live here. And you." I paused, then repeated slowly, "You're in the wrong place." She smiled faintly, a soft, almost sad smile, and as I turned to leave, I couldn't help but glance back. She was gone. The street was empty once more, and the park looked as it always had, just the same as before. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that somehow I had been pulled into a different version of my own city, where streets and buildings didn't quite match, where the lines between reality and memory blurred in a way that left me uneasy. And, from that day on, every time I walk down that street, I feel it, the sense that I might not be in the city I think I'm in at all. That maybe, just maybe, I've stepped into someone else's world entirely. And I wonder, more than I should, if she's still looking for 4th Avenue. It was a regular Thursday evening, the kind of evening where nothing feels extraordinary, just the familiar rhythm of the city settling into night. I was walking down the street, my mind lost in the usual haze of thoughts about work, life, and everything in between. The city was quiet, but the hum of distant traffic and the occasional chime of a bicycle bell kept the evening from feeling completely empty. I had taken the same route many times before, heading home after a long day. The street was well lit by the old street lamps that had stood for decades, and the shops along the way were mostly shuttered, save for a few restaurants and convenience stores. But as I passed one of the older buildings on the block, I noticed something I hadn't seen in years: a phone booth. It seemed out of place. There was something odd about seeing it, like a relic from another time. I'd passed this spot hundreds of times and never once thought to look at the booth. The city had long since replaced most of the payphones with cell service, and booths like these had become part of the forgotten past. But there it was, standing on the corner as if it had never been moved. I didn't stop, not at first. But then, out of nowhere, the phone inside the booth began to ring. The sound was sharp in the quiet of the evening, and my steps faltered as I heard it. The ring was steady and insistent, echoing through the street like it was calling out for someone. My initial instinct was to keep walking. Why would I answer a public phone, especially in the middle of nowhere like this? But something in me hesitated. I stood there for a moment, unsure of why I felt drawn to it. The ring continued, cutting through the stillness, growing louder with each passing second. It was almost as if the phone was waiting for me. I glanced around. The street was empty, the shadows long and stretched by the streetlights. There was no one else in sight. I took a deep breath, shaking my head to rid myself of the impulse. It was just a phone. It could be anyone. But for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should answer it. That it was meant for me. I stood there for a second longer, battling my own thoughts. What if it's important? I thought. What if it's someone trying to reach me? The phone continued ringing, almost relentlessly, and before I knew it, I found myself walking over to the booth. I stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the phone through the glass. The receiver hung limply, waiting. It felt strange. Like the phone wasn't just calling out to anyone, it was calling out to me. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the handle, and for a moment, I considered turning away. But I didn't. I opened the door, stepped inside the booth, and picked up the receiver. The moment I held it to my ear, a chill ran down my spine. There was nothing at first, just static. The faint buzzing of the line, like I had dialed into the wrong number. I almost hung up, about to step back out of the booth, when the voice came. It was low, almost whispering, but unmistakably clear. You shouldn't have answered. The words sent a jolt of fear through me, my heart racing as I stood frozen. In place, the voice was unfamiliar, but there was something so chilling about it, something deeply unsettling. As if the person on the other end knew more than they should. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I felt a tightness in my throat, like I had forgotten how to speak. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Then the voice spoke again, slow and deliberate. The words like a warning. It's already too late. I couldn't move, couldn't pull the receiver from my ear. My fingers clutched it tighter, like I was trapped in a loop. My mind screamed for me to hang up, to drop the phone, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to disconnect. You've answered now, the voice continued. And you'll never be able to forget. My stomach twisted, the dread crawling up my spine as the voice lingered in my ear. There was a slight pause, and then I heard it. The sound of something shuffling, scraping along the floor. My breath hitched, and I glanced quickly over my shoulder, but there was no one on the street. It was still empty, just as I had left it, but the voice on the other end didn't stop. Now you'll see, you'll know, you'll understand what you've done. I dropped the receiver, the noise of the phone slamming back into the booth echoing through the night. I didn't think, I didn't pause. I turned and ran, running faster than I ever thought I could, as if something dark and heavy was chasing me, something that had been awakened the moment I answered the phone. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow as I sprinted through the streets, not caring if anyone saw me. I couldn't shake the image of the phone booth, of the receiver, and of that voice, the warning that had echoed in my mind over and over. That night, when I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sank down on the couch. My body trembling with a fear I couldn't explain. The lights seemed too bright, the air too still. The silence of the apartment was suffocating, but it wasn't the same silence I'd known. It was something worse. I tried to tell myself that it had been some kind of prank, some twisted joke, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew that the voice, the words, meant something else. They were not just a warning, they were a promise. And though I tried to sleep, to forget, I couldn't. I knew that from that moment on, I would never be able to forget what I had heard. Because the moment I answered the phone, everything changed. And now, every night, as I lay in bed, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me waiting. I'm not sure what I've invited into my life, but I know one thing for certain: I shouldn't have answered. And now, no matter what I do, I can never undo it. It was just another evening, a typical evening in the city. The kind of day where the sun starts setting, casting its orange glow over the skyline, and the hum of traffic fills the air. The streets were crowded, as usual, with people rushing home after work, with the occasional tourist wandering around, looking lost and trying to navigate the maze of buildings. I had just finished a meeting and was walking down the familiar path to my apartment, lost in thought about the small things that made up my life: the errands to run, the bills to pay, the emails I still had to respond to. It was all ordinary, the same as every other evening, but something felt off, even though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. As I walked down the street, I noticed a strange stillness in the air, a quiet that didn't belong in a city like this. The sounds of traffic, the distant voices, the music coming from a nearby cafe, all of it seemed muffled, like someone had turned down the volume on life itself. The breeze that had been stirring earlier suddenly stopped, and the air felt thicker, heavier, almost like it was pressing in from all sides. I slowed my pace, feeling the weight of the world around me, and glanced around. The street, which I had walked down countless times before, looked different. Not drastically, but subtly, in a way that left a gnawing feeling in my stomach. The buildings were still the same, the familiar storefronts lining the sidewalk, but the colors seemed off. The neon lights in the windows had a faint, almost sickly hue to them, and the brick of the buildings looked faded, as though the city was slowly losing its vibrancy, like it had been bleached by time. I stopped walking, my feet reluctant to take another step, as if my body itself was sensing something wasn't right. I turned my head to look at the people around me, expecting to see anyone walking past, their faces familiar in the way that people in a city always are, but I saw no one. The sidewalks were empty, the streets eerily still. There wasn't a single soul in sight, not even a stray dog or a cyclist passing by. I stood there for a moment, my heart beating faster now, a knot tightening in my chest. The empty streets seemed to stretch on forever, an expanse of deserted concrete that shouldn't be so quiet. My feet itched to move, but my mind screamed at me to stay still. Something felt wrong. Then, for no reason at all, I turned around, and that's when it happened. The city was gone. At first, I thought I was seeing things, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no. The buildings had vanished, the streets, the lights, the noise, all of it had disappeared. In its place was nothing, just a vast, open emptiness. There were no tall skyscrapers, no familiar stores, no rows of cars lining the street. The road I had just walked down was now just a bare path, stretching out into an endless void of gray. There wasn't even a horizon, just a blank, oppressive space that swallowed everything around me. I blinked, sure that I was imagining it, that I'd somehow wandered into some kind of dream or alternate reality. but the more I looked, the more real it felt. I turned back toward where the city had been, but there was only the same void stretching out in front of me, as if the entire city had been wiped away in an instant, leaving nothing behind but this empty, suffocating blankness. Panic rose within me, my breath quickening as I turned in circles, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. I tried to call out, but no sound came. I opened my mouth, tried to scream, but there was nothing, no echo, no reply, no wind, no voices, nothing at all. It was as if I had been erased from existence. I staggered backward, my mind reeling with confusion, terror flooding my chest. How could this happen? I had just been walking down the street, surrounded by people, by the noise, by life. And now it was all gone. I took a few more steps, each one echoing louder in the silence, but there was no place to go. There was no direction, no walls to guide me, no sense of where I was or how to leave. It was as though the city had been plucked out of existence, and I was left in a place where nothing made sense. I stumbled forward, my feet heavy, my hands trembling. My mind raced for explanations, for any reason that could explain this impossible situation. Asterisk, had I lost my mind? Was I dreaming? Was this a hallucination? But the longer I stood there, the more real it felt, the more terrifying it became. The empty streets stretched on, endless, without even a single landmark to make me believe it was real. I looked around, but all I saw was that same gray emptiness, that sense of something having been ripped away. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself to the weight of the emptiness, I heard something. A sound, faint but distinct. The soft shuffle of footsteps, just barely audible, echoing against the void. I turned toward it, my heart pounding with hope that I wasn't alone. And there, standing in the distance, was a figure. At first, I couldn't make out who or what it was. The figure was small, a shadow against the gray backdrop. But as it drew closer, I saw the outline of a person, a woman, I think. Her face was obscured, her form blurred as if she were a ghost, a distortion in the air. She was walking toward me slowly, her steps deliberate, as though she knew exactly where she was going. Even though I had no idea where I was anymore, I stood frozen in place, too afraid to move. My body screamed for me to run, to escape, to get away from whatever this was. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, from the figure that was drawing nearer, moving closer, closer still. Her pace was steady, but her presence felt wrong, like she didn't belong here, like she was part of the emptiness that surrounded me. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped. She lifted her head, and her eyes met mine, dark, hollow eyes that stared through me, as if she could see the very essence of who I was. And there was nothing but silence between us. And then she spoke. Asterisk, you're not supposed to be here. Asterisk, the words hit me like a slap, and I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. She stood there, her eyes never leaving mine, her presence growing more suffocating with every second. Before I could react, she turned, her figure fading into the gray emptiness, leaving me alone again. The void stretched on around me, endless, cold and silent. I don't know how long I stood there, or if I even moved, but the longer I waited, the more I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't in the city anymore. I wasn't even in the world I knew. I had been pulled somewhere I couldn't escape, and I couldn't understand why. The city had disappeared, and no matter how many times I turned around, no matter how many steps I took, I could never find my way back. I had just moved into the apartment, a small unit on the 5th floor of an old building in the heart of the city. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was affordable, and I liked the idea of living somewhere with a bit of history. The building had seen better days, no doubt. The walls were cracked in places, the elevator creaked every time it moved, and the air always smelled faintly of dust and aged wood. But there was something charming about it, something that made it feel like home even before I'd fully settled in. The building was mostly empty. It had been that way for years, from what I was told. I'd seen a few neighbors coming and going when I first moved in, but after a few weeks, I noticed the hallways were eerily quiet. I rarely ran into anyone. Most of the doors were shut tight, and there was no sound coming from the other apartments. It felt like a ghost of a place, a relic from another time. The night I first saw her, I was returning home after a late shift, my feet dragging from the exhaustion of the day. The building was especially quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. The elevator groaned as it took me up to the 5th floor, and when the doors opened, I stepped out into the dim hallway, the low hum of the lights above the only sound. As I approached my door, something made me glance to the side, toward the apartment at the end of the hall, the one with the window that faced the street. I hadn't thought much of it before, just a window, as far as I knew. The apartment had been empty for as long as I'd lived there, or so I assumed. The windows were always closed, the blinds drawn, never a flicker of movement behind them. But tonight, something caught my eye. There she was, standing in the window, a figure framed by the soft glow of the streetlights outside, looking down at the street below. She was motionless, her silhouette sharp against the dark, the faint light casting shadows on her face. I could just make out her features, long hair, her head tilted slightly, as if she were lost in thought. She was wearing a long, dark dress, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of familiarity. It wasn't the kind of thing I'd expect to see in an empty building, especially not so late at night. I froze, my hand still hovering over the doorknob. I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave that apartment since I moved in. In fact, I couldn't remember ever seeing anyone there at all. The building was supposed to be mostly vacant, with only a few of the apartments still occupied. So why was someone standing in that window? I stared at her for what felt like an eternity, but she didn't move. There was no sign of a reflection in the glass, no shift of light that would indicate she was simply a shadow or a trick of the mind. She was there, clear and present, standing still in the window, her gaze locked somewhere into the distance. The hair on my neck stood on end. Something about it didn't feel right. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I had been working long hours, and exhaustion sometimes made me see things that weren't there. I shook my head and dismissed the thought. Maybe it was just another tenant, someone I hadn't met yet. But then, something else nagged at me. The building had been empty for years. I hadn't thought much about it before, but it was starting to dawn on me. The leasing agent had told me the building was quiet, that most of the apartments had been unoccupied for some time. The fact that this woman was in a unit that had been empty for who knows how long, standing there so still, only made the whole situation feel more unsettling. I decided to find out, to knock on the door, to check if maybe there was someone staying there temporarily. But as I moved closer, I heard a door creak open somewhere in the hall. My heart skipped a beat. I turned to find nothing, no one. The hallway was still empty. The creak of the door had seemed far away, like it had come from the apartment itself. And then, just as suddenly as I had noticed her, the woman in the window was gone. She had disappeared, leaving nothing but the empty, darkened window behind her. The room was silent again, and I stood there, staring at the window, unsure whether I had even seen her in the first place. I took a deep breath, my pulse racing, and finally opened the door to my apartment. I had to get inside, away from that empty hallway, away from the unsettling silence. But as I stepped inside, the unease lingered. Something in the air felt heavier now, as if I had crossed some invisible boundary that I wasn't meant to cross. The next morning, I decided to check the apartment at the end of the hall. I didn't expect anyone to answer the door. If it was anything like the other vacant units, it would be locked or simply empty. But when I reached the door, I found something odd. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The hair on the back of my neck stood up again, that same feeling of unease creeping over me. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The apartment was exactly as it should have been, dusty, filled with shadows, the air stale. It looked abandoned, just like I had expected. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the windows were shut, and the faint smell of mold lingered in the corners. But then I saw it, the window at the far end of the room, where I had seen her the night before. It was wide open. I don't know what to make of it. There was no sign of anyone ever having lived there, no belongings, no indication that anyone had been inside in years. The building was still mostly empty, or so it seemed. And yet, the memory of the woman in the window lingered with me. I never saw her again, and I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or a reflection from another apartment. But every time I walk past that end of the hallway, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching from that window, waiting for me to look. And every time I glance toward the window, I can't help but wonder what happened to the building that made it empty for so long, and who, or what, had been standing there, waiting in the dark. I was getting used to the quiet of the neighborhood. After moving to this city, everything had felt so loud at first, the noise of traffic, the blare of horns, the hum of city life. But now, a few months later, I had adjusted to the pace. I took evening walks through the narrow streets, passing by old brownstones with their faded windows and rusted fire escape ladders. The buildings were old, some of them in a state of disrepair, but there was charm in their age. I had learned to appreciate the quietness of my little corner of the world. It was a warm evening, the air thick with the late summer humidity. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The street was empty except for me. Most people had already retreated indoors, seeking shelter from the heat. But I enjoyed the evening air and the solitary walk. As I passed by one of the buildings, I noticed something strange. The fire escape ladder on the side of the building had fallen. I hadn't thought much about it at first. The ladders on these old buildings were often in a state of neglect, some rusty and crooked, others hanging at odd angles, barely clinging to the walls. But this one was different. It wasn't just hanging loosely. The ladder had fallen completely to the ground, the metal rungs scraping against the pavement with a harsh, screeching noise. It was as if it had been dropped, almost violently, from its perched high above. I stopped and looked up. The fire escape, which had once clung to the building like a metal skeleton, was now empty. The space where it had once been was eerily still. No sign of movement, no one climbing up or down, no one repairing it. Just an empty, silent space. The sight unsettled me. It wasn't just the noise of the ladder falling, it was the fact that there was no one around, no workers, no emergency crews, not a single soul trying to fix it or climb it. There was a certain finality to the scene, as if the ladder had fallen for a reason, and no one was supposed to touch it again. I stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of unease creep up my spine. My eyes scanned the street around me, but it was still empty. I felt like I was waiting for something, waiting for someone to appear, but no one did. I continued walking, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. But the image of that fallen ladder stayed with me, its twisted metal rungs lying in the street like a warning. I couldn't help but glance back at the building one last time, before I turned the corner, and that's when I saw it, a figure, standing just beneath the window where the fire escape had once been. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it just a trick of the shadows or a person passing by, but no. The figure was still there, perfectly still, standing, just beneath the open window. I couldn't see their face clearly, just the silhouette against the fading light. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, staring up at the empty space where the fire escape ladder had once been attached. I felt my heart rate quicken. Who was that? Why were they standing there, staring up at the building like that? I tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe they were just another resident, waiting for someone, or just caught in the moment. But there was something strange about the way they stood, too still, too silent. It felt unnatural. It felt like they didn't belong there at all. I forced myself to keep walking, ignoring the chill that had spread across my arms. But I couldn't stop glancing back, and when I did, the figure was gone. I didn't think much of it that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about it the next day. I walked past the building again, my eyes lingering on the spot where the fire escape ladder had fallen, wondering if it had been fixed, if anyone had come to deal with it. But when I looked up, the ladder was still there, sprawled across the ground, just like the night before. The figure wasn't there, though. No one was standing beneath the window anymore. It was strange, but I tried to push it out of my mind. There was nothing more to it, I told myself. It was just a falling ladder, just a shadow in the street. But I couldn't help but feel that something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Over the next few weeks, I passed by the building several times. Each time, the fire escape ladder remained on the ground, untouched, ignored. By everyone, it became an odd fixture on that stretch of street. And every time I walked by, I couldn't help but look up, half expecting to see someone standing beneath the window again, waiting, as if they were waiting for the ladder to return to its rightful place. Then, one evening, I was walking home, later than usual. The sun had set, and the street was quiet, empty, except for the occasional car passing by. As I neared the building with the fallen ladder, I heard a noise. A faint scraping sound. I stopped in my tracks. It came from the direction of the building, coming from the fire escape. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced up, and to my horror, the fire escape ladder was moving. It was as if it was trying to lift itself back up to the side of the building. The rungs scraped against the concrete, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. But there was no one around. No one was fixing it. No workers, no crews. The ladder was moving by itself. I couldn't breathe. I stared at it, my feet rooted to the pavement. I was paralyzed, my mind screaming for me to leave, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The fire escape climbed back up, inch by inch, its metal rungs creaking as it returned to the wall. It seemed almost deliberate, like it was being pulled by invisible hands, reaching for something above. And just as quickly as it had started, the ladder settled back into place, the last rung clicking into position with an unsettling finality. The street returned to its eerie silence. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 questions, but no answers. Had I imagined it? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I walked away quickly, my mind too full of the strange event to make sense of anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something that wasn't supposed to happen. The ladder had fallen, but it wasn't done. It had come back. And I couldn't help but wonder who or what had been waiting for it to return.